It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
Hey there folks, what's up? Hope you've been keeping well and 2022 is off to a better start than the previous 2 years. It's your boy back again, and today I want to talk about something that, like Lunastra, has been on my mind. I want to talk about a particular monster that, whilst I wouldn't consider it to be as divisive as Lunastra, was certainly controversial when it was added to Monster Hunter World late in the cycle of Iceborne. Today I want to talk about one of the series' most powerful elder dragons, Alatreon. Now, Alatreon hasn't been around for as long as Lunastra has, being introduced as the final online boss for Monster Hunter Tri. It is, however, on a different power level when compared to the other more common elder dragons, so it's more understandable that it's a difficult fight. So, with several new mechanics and a fresh coat of paint in World, I want to ask the question, was Alatreon really that bad? Now, to understand the iteration of Alatreon in Monster Hunter World, we need to first understand where it came from, so welcome back to Peak Ginger's Monster Hunter History class. Today we'll be taking a look at the 3rd generation. Let's jump in. Monster Hunter Tri released on the Wii in 2009, or 2010 depending on where in the world you live, and was a significant shake-up for the series. It introduced a bunch of new elements such as the Switch Axe, Brute Wyverns, Leviathans, and of course, underwater combat, which I still think was awesome. Y'all can fight me. Now, given all of these new toys to play with, it's interesting that the final online boss, at least on the surface, is just another 4-legged, 2-winged elder dragon. Alatreon sports sleek black scales and a dull purple hue with 2 oversized horns adorning its head, but it is by no means your standard elder. Alatreon falls into a specific subclass of monster known as the dangerous first-class monsters, or more commonly, the black dragons. This group encompasses all 3 variants of the Fatalis, as well as Alatreon and Diamoralis. Oh, and also apparently, and I'm definitely going to butcher these names, Disuferoa and Mephistopheles from Frontier and Online. Now, this class of monster are supposedly able to bring about the end of the world if they so desire, and Alatreon itself is said to possess the powers of all the true Elder Dragons. It is, however, elementally unstable, and as such fails to use them all simultaneously or to their full extent. This, however, does not make it a pushover by any means, and Alatreon is so powerful that it resides alone in the Sacred Land. In Generation 3, anyway. It still had different modes back then, but it was less about active elements and more about being on the ground or in the air. Alatreon's attack patterns consisted of fire and dragon-based attacks such as charges and headbutts while it was on the ground, and thunder and ice-based attacks such as breath attacks and swooping down on the hunter when flying. Oh, and also back then, it just didn't use the water element at all. Its battle was certainly difficult and unique, and it could easily dispatch unprepared hunters. The player's main goals, apart from just slaying it, were to focus on attacking the horns to stagger Alatreon and eventually break both of them to prevent it from using its full power, a concept that was carried over into Iceborne. Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate then saw minimal changes to Alatreon, mainly just focused around when its flight mode triggers, so let's fast forward to the 4th generation, where Alatreon can be found in both Monster Hunter Generations and Generations Ultimate. And well, it kinda just remains the same as Gen 3, except now it is battled in the Ingle Isle, rather than the Sacred Land. The Ingle Isle is just the 4th generation's ominous volcano arena where you fight all the big volcanic fellas like Alatreon, Crimson Fatalis, and Eschaton. So with that established and not much more to say about the pre-world era, let's now jump into Generation 5. On July 9th, 2020, a dark shadow loomed over the new world. A shadow that would lead to many an online argument, as Alatreon descended upon the secluded valley, and boy, was it here to make an impression. Easily the hardest challenge World had to offer at the time of its release, Alatreon had gotten a few upgrades since its last appearance. It was visually similar, with a few minor changes, mainly centered around it being somewhat stockier, which is a common trend in the 5th generation in general. Looking at its abilities, it would seem it has been putting in the practice and getting the results with regards to its control over the elements. Rather than exclusively using fire and dragon in ground mode, and then thunder and ice in flight mode, Alatreon can now use all the elements whenever it sees fit. It does, however, now have 3 separate active modes: Fire Active, Ice Active, and Dragon Active, each of which dictate which element is more prominent. And this is where the problems begin. A battle against Alatreon is pretty formulaic because of the mechanics of the fight. It will start in either Ice or Fire Active mode, which is dictated by the name of the quest. It will then transition to Dragon Active mode, then it will Eschaton Judgment, following which it will then switch back to the original active state, or to the opposite active state depending on how well you're traveling. And there are 2 mechanics in particular that would dictate your chances. 1, the amount of elemental damage you are doing, and 2, whether or not you've broken its horns. So, ask anyone what their problem is with Alatreon, and almost universally, it is the Eschaton Judgment attack, and another very important mechanic that we'll get to in just a minute. And I mean, like, always. Even when people say that that's not the problem, they tend to just explain around these mechanics and end up back at them. Now, what is the Eschaton Judgment? First of all, it's a fucking sweet name for an attack. But more importantly, it is Alatreon's big, powerful finishing move. Now, these kinds of things are pretty common in Monster Hunter. Many monsters, especially the late game ones, have some sort of massive finishing attack that they will rarely use, but if they connect, they tend to deal a hell of a lot of damage or just outright kill you. Teostra and Lunastra have their supernovas, Nergigante has its massive dive bomb, Safijiva has Sapphire of the Emperor, also an awesome name for an attack, and Fatalis has its area-wide fire breath. But what makes Alatreons so problematic? Well, what it comes down to are the extra mechanics of Eschaton Judgment, and well, more simply, those other attacks I mentioned have a very simple fix. Get the hell out of the way. This is not quite as simple for Alatreon. And so the first major problem is here. You cannot avoid Eschaton Judgment. Like, you literally cannot escape it. It is going to hit you, and it is going to hurt. The attack hits every player in the area with no means of avoiding, blocking, or hiding from it. On top of that, the area that you fight Alatreon in, the Secluded Valley, removes the ability to use Farcasters, so you can't even return to base to avoid it. It's something that is understandably frustrating, and I can see why people would rather just not deal with it at all. What makes it more bizarre is that other endgame monsters such as Fatalis and Safijiva have specific environmental designs to avoid their finishing moves, but they just went nah, no can do for Alatreon. Forcing the player to take a hit is just a bizarre design decision, and overall just runs counter to Monster Hunter's design philosophy in general, in my opinion at least. With that being said, I can appreciate when a dev team tries to shake things up, and just giving us another supernova attack where we just stand behind terrain like Behemoth and Safijiva and Fatalis could cheapen the experience. The second major problem, and probably the biggest issue, is the elemental damage check. In order to not outright die to Eschaton Judgment, a set amount of elemental damage must be dealt to Alatreon to stagger it and weaken the attack. And yes, I know Team Darkside did a video about surviving a full strength one, but for the average online 4-man party, that is just not going to happen. Once weakened, Eschaton Judgment will still do a shitload of damage, but it can now be outhealed more reliably. Now, why is this a problem? Well, it's sort of a continuation of a separate issue in World, and that issue is that raw damage is just too damn good. The vast majority of sets that people were focusing on or building at the time were simply built around enhancing your raw damage, critical hit rate, and critical hit damage. People prized themselves on those big fat damage numbers, so when Alatreon rolled around and basically made it impossible to just brute force your way through, people didn't like that. On top of that, if you also don't manage to break its horns, Alatreon transitions to the opposite active state from which it started, meaning that you are double screwed because now the element of your weapon probably does next to no elemental damage, which basically only gives you the option of abandoning the quest and restarting it, or changing your entire loadout after you probably died to that Eschaton Judgment that just happened. Now for my own personal take. I don't really have an issue with the damage check. I think it's a cool new mechanic that forces you to shake things up and build and itemize differently, which is always something I like in any given Monster Hunter game. And honestly, that was likely the entire intent of the design. That being said though, my experience does not reflect everyone else's, and the issue here is really down to what weapon you main. There was a particular comment on my Lunastra video that made a very good point. In that video, spoiler alert, I came to the conclusion that Lunastra was just not as bad as everyone says it is. However, that comes from someone who has learned to battle Lunastra with the insect glaive. In that scenario, my weapon choice allows me to avoid being on the ground and thus avoiding the fire puddles, and at the same time taking advantage of Lunastra's better hit zones on her wings. It's a similar situation here. Being able to be airborne and have the massive elemental output of the Kinsect certainly lends itself to a better experience against Alatreon. And whilst I would encourage every player to experiment with different weapons, I don't think that anyone should feel left out or cheated just because of the playstyle they prefer. A great example of this would be people who like to use the gun lance. Now, I'm not a big gun lance guy myself, so forgive me if I get something wrong. But the main thing that makes the gun lance different from a regular lance is, well, the gun part. But the shells don't deal any elemental damage whatsoever, so that extra unique part of the weapon is suddenly so much less effective against this one monster, in a way that hinders the overall experience significantly. Now, there are varying elemental modifiers for each weapon behind the scenes that assist with the Alatreon fight, but the fact of the matter is that whilst on the surface the aim was to encourage more diverse builds, it actually just ended up removing player choice entirely. Whilst raw damage is more or less the best option, every single other monster in the game can be taken down with either a raw or elemental build. All of them, except Alatreon. So, as we round out this video, what is the answer to the question? What is the answer to, was Alatreon really that bad? The debate is still out there and varies between who you ask. It also tends to bring out a good amount of people that just like to complain about everything Monster Hunter related, along with a bunch of get-gooders as well. I personally really enjoy Alatreon quite a bit. I think it's a fun and challenging fight that I like to do every now and then just for the hell of it. Alatreon is difficult, and well, it's supposed to be difficult. It's the penultimate boss of the entire game, so in that regard, Alatreon really isn't that bad. But I don't think the difficulty is the problem. Taking away player choice in a series that boasts it as a core part of the game and as something that really appeals to the player base is just a poor design choice and poor execution, and was always going to alienate some players. Alatreon has all the right elements for a truly excellent fight, but just strays from the vision and shoehorns the players a little too much to make it work. Bad isn't really the right word, but Alatreon is by no means the best or the worst thing to ever happen to Monster Hunter. A bit of a cop-out answer, I know, but that's how I feel about it. I completely see why people don't like it, but I personally really enjoy Alatreon. Anyway, thanks for watching the video, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And while you're at it, why not go and follow me on Twitter as well? It's the best way to stay up to date on what I'm up to, and you get to see all my shit takes as well. Anyway, that's about it. Thanks, guys. I'll catch you on the next one.